I want to give you a big background on myself and the reason I think why I'm here and why I think I have something to say. I started my career 15 years ago in the quality area. Before that, I also did some software engineering for a CRM company, an e-government company. But then I started with a company called Segway. I guess most people don't remember what Segway is. It's not the Segways, okay? Segway, I started actually as a tester for their testing tools. We built load testing and functional testing tools, but mainly I was part of the load testing tool team. We built a tool called Silk Performer. I'm not sure if anybody has done any load testing and performance testing, but that was back in the days, 15 years ago, head-to-head with the back then #1 tool load runner from HP. And what I did with them, I started as a tester, became a developer, but then soon my boss told me, you know what, there's better developers out there, even though you think you're a good developer, but I think it's better if you actually help our customers to break apps and tell them why they break. And I got a lot of stories from them. And one actually thing that I'm not sure if I mentioned this on Monday, but maybe I did. My first engagement, my first load testing engagement I had was with the German unemployment office. They had to roll out new software that was supposed to be used by up to 100,000 concurrent users. And I got there, we had a 1-week engagement, and I was very excited, my first engagement in Germany. And after 15 minutes, everything was over. Because after 15 minutes, we ran a test with 5 users, the whole system broke. And the reason why it broke is some of the reasons I'm going to show you today, very basic mistakes that I actually am very frustrated that we are still building software with these basic flaws in there. And I want to take my chance basically today to tell you about these basic mistakes so that you don't repeat them, okay? So I started with Segway. Segway later became Borland, might be a company that you're more familiar with. I worked for them for 8 years. Then I joined the call from my former colleague and CTO at Borland because he wanted to build a different product where we can actually figure out under load why the applications are breaking, what's the SQL statement that has a problem, which exceptions are thrown, which methods are slow. So he founded Dynatrace. Dynatrace became CompuWare. And since a year or so, we're back to Dynatrace. That's kind of my circle of life. And in the last 15 years, mainly what I did is really I helped the community. I helped people that use our products. And now I'm also driving our free product. So all the stuff that I show you today, you don't need to buy our product. You can just download it. And for developers and testers, it's totally free, everything I show you today. I think that's also something that we give back to the community. So the talk today, the first one, if you remember the title, if I go back, DevOps delivering high-quality software like Facebook and Co. Who heard about DevOps? Okay, a lot of hands. I'm sure if I ask everyone individually, you probably heard different definitions on what DevOps is. I'm sure if you are engaged with people with tool vendors like Dynatrace, like HP, like AppDynamics, New Relic, they tell you need to buy our tools and then you're DevOps ready. And that's bullshit, okay? DevOps has nothing to do with a particular tool that you buy. And the reason why I mentioned this, in December last year, I was speaking at the Boston DevOps Days. And before I got on stage, people pointed fingers at me and said, because of people like you and all the other companies, nobody knows what DevOps is about anymore. And I want to just be very open with you. So I think, especially marketing and salespeople, don't get them to talk to you and say, you need to buy our tools and then everything will be better. DevOps for me has a lot to do with cultural change. I used to be a tester and then a developer. I know I was on both sides. So I know, for instance, that testers and developers typically don't work well together. Because as a developer, I want to build new code, and the tester finds the problems in my code, right? And the same is true for operations and development. And I think what DevOps tries to solve is trying to make sure that we can actually understand that we're all working on a piece of software that should have high quality, and if it doesn't run, we should all have a good interest in fixing it. So we have to work together as a team. So I want to give you some examples on companies I worked for. And the first example actually came to me from a guy who is operating knockoutcasino.com. Knockoutcasino.com is an online casino. And this guy, he's the operator that came to me. Tom was his name. And he read one of my blogs, and he said, we are moving towards a more DevOps-y culture. That means I'm getting more builds from my developers. But based on my own history, I know every time I get a new build, I'm the guy who sits there on the weekends and at nights and gets the alerts because all the servers are burning down because the new code is crap. Okay? And he said, I'm just fearing, just because we call it DevOps now, I'm just sitting there, I spend more weekends and more nights. And he asked me, can you have a quick sanity check on the website that they're going to deploy, and can you tell me if you think it's good or not? And what I did, how many web developers are here, or building web applications? Yeah? I hope most of you are familiar that there is built-in browser diagnostics tools in your browser, and there has been a movement called web performance optimization for years that talk about things like you should not have a landing page that is 10 megabytes big that has 282 images on that page. And what you see down here, this is what we call the waterfall diagram. And I know it's a little hard to see, but on the bottom here, you see the individual domains where these images come from and the CSS. 99% of the images, so 280, were all delivered from a single server. And if you know the browser internals, the browser can only open between 4 to 8 parallel physical connections. So that means you can download 8 at a time, and then 8, 8, 8, 8. That's why it takes that long to download that content. The only one other poor attempt that they did to fix this situation, this blue bar is a CSS file that they put on a CDN, a content delivery network, like Akamai, Amazon has Microsoft. A CDN is, the purpose of a CDN, in case you don't know, is to deliver static content like images and JavaScript files and CSS closer, from a server closer to the end user. Unfortunately, what they did, they picked a very cheap one. And the cheap one had the problem that the servers were not in the target area of their end users. The end users, the casino is operating mainly out of Europe. The servers of the CDN were in Asia. That's why I had 1.8 seconds of connect time. And this goes against any rules, okay? So I'm telling you, if you start to develop software faster and deploy it more frequent, because now you're all DevOpsy, and you just push software faster through the pipeline, and you make mistakes like this, then you will just fail much faster. Another example that I have from a financial company, they were rolling out a new report, and the problem with that is you could log in, like an online bank, and you could say, show me my transaction history. You could say, last day, last week, last month, and the new feature, the new build that they got, unfortunately had a problem with the time checks, with the time frame checks. So basically, every time you logged on, you downloaded the whole transaction history of like your last 10 years with the bank, which resulted in two very interesting things. They had a SQL statement that took 210 seconds to execute. Right? Not very good. And the second thing, what they also did, and it's a little hard to see here, they also got Splunk recently. I guess Splunk is a known, hopefully a lot of you know Splunk. Splunk is a great tool to analyze log files for different purposes. And they were basically saying, we get Splunk, so in order to feed Splunk, we need to log a lot. And they logged a lot. The whole report took 526 seconds, 110 was the SQL, and the rest was all spent in logging. So if logging becomes your performance problem, then you're not doing it right, okay? So there's all these stories, and in the title, oh, I know, it's lovely, right? my presentation is called Learning from the Unicorns. So what are the unicorns? In case you follow a little bit of the stories, we call these companies the unicorn companies. Google, Etsy, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. Why do we call them the unicorns? Because they're basically spearheading the way we develop and deploy software. Okay, there's amazing stories. I think those things that these companies are quoted for is how often these companies deploy new software into production. Some examples, Cars.com is one of our clients in the US. They used to deploy twice a year. Now they're doing it twice a day, so 700 deployments per year. They did not get there because they bought our product. They got there because they made a fundamental change in the way they develop, test, and deploy software. And some tools along the way helped them. But the major change was the cultural change, how they do it. By the way, if they deploy so often, that doesn't mean that their website, Cars.com, changes significantly twice a day. The key to success is small changes, being able to push maybe a fix for a JavaScript file out there fast, or add a new Facebook like button on one of the product pages. Small changes that you can also revert back fast. The most impressive one is obviously Amazon. They deploy into production, or a change into production, every 11.6 seconds. Okay? But again, these are very small changes. It could just be deploying a new virtual machine that supports their Amazon South Africa store, because now they know they have a promotion and therefore they need more servers. very small changes that they do. By the way, all of these companies, they all have typically developer blogs. You should check them out. Etsy has some phenomenal stories. On the first day of employment at Etsy, if you're an engineer, you need to make a change to the code, adding your, I think, your profile picture and your bio on the website, write a test for it, run it through CI, deploy it into production on the first day of employment. And if it fails, you don't go home before your code is not out there and works. And there's some great stories, and you can read all of them online. The problem with this is, and what a lot of companies invite me to speak, and they are sometimes afraid because they said, well, my management, my CEO, my CIO, my CTO, they all read about these unicorn stories. And now they say, we need to be just as Amazon. And not everybody can be like Amazon. Not everybody can be like Facebook. So please, if you have the chance, make sure that you're not just becoming a unicorn playground. Just blindly copying a unicorn can end up in something like this. Okay? A bad copy of a unicorn is a very ugly copy. So please make sure you don't make that mistakes. Feel free to push back. Yes, we can learn a lot of them from these people, but don't just blindly copy it. There are, let's say, the next generation of unicorn companies that looked at these others, and they regularly meet at conferences such as Velocity. I'm not sure who has heard about Velocity. It's an amazing conference. It started a couple of years ago on the theme Web Performance Optimization, and now it moved into continuous delivery. The current theme is building resilient systems at scale. That's where the Google, the Etsy, and the Facebook talk about their stories. But nowadays, we hear other companies too. Capital One Financial, and so this year, I was there in May in Santa Clara, and I listened to Capital One, Target, and IG, so financial company, online retailer, and another financial company. And here are some interesting things for them. Capital One, it took them 3 years to go from Waterfall to Agile. They failed in the first attempts, but it took them 3 years. They have 220 apps, and they deploy every app once a month. And that's good enough for them. They don't need to do every 11.6 seconds. But they can do it once a month, even without all the constraints they have from a legal perspective. They are a financial company. They have certain things they need to go through. What was more interesting for me were these two statements. They do not have any manual tester anymore. All of the testing is automated now. That means the manual testers that they had before either do automation or are back on the job market. Other thing, we don't log bugs, we fix them. When they get to implement the next feature, they take the task from the storyboard and they work on the next story. The developer takes it, but also the tester that is sitting in that same Agile team. And if they're sitting next together and I code, I check it in, I say, hey Joe, checked in my changes, and then Joe says, okay, I'll check it out, build it, and oh, here's a bug. They don't use Jira or anything else to log these bugs if they're just communicating with each other. And the whole thing is not done if not both parties say done. Okay? So we don't log bugs while we're developing it, we just fix them while it's being developed. IG, another financial company, they say everyone can do continuous delivery, even though their engineering team at the beginning told them it's not possible in a financial company because we have so many big constraints, but they say it is possible. And the other thing what was interesting was Target. Target is a retailer, and I think some of the things that I wrote down, measures built in, that means if you are a developer and you build a new feature, you're also responsible to put in metrics so that later on, when it's live, your code live, you can actually monitor. Is the code executing? How is it used? What's the performance? Do we have any problems? And in case there is a problem, they have a feedback loop back to their desk. Also, what's very interesting is this educate your peers and promote your wins. So what they do internally, they have DevOps days that they do on a regular basis internally in the company. So DevOps days is a concept, is a conference concept that has been around for a while, but they do it internally. Every couple of weeks, they come together and then somebody talks about what they just did in the last couple of weeks, promote their wins, and therefore also infect others so that they also want to do the same things. We also had our own conference recently, and I'm not sure if you've heard about this company. Verizon is one of the largest mobile providers and network providers in the United States. And they invited me to basically give a similar presentation what I'm giving you now, and then they gave me their story of their last 4 years. And they said in 2011, they were on the brink of either we change something dramatically or we are going to be soon out of business because we cannot keep up anymore with the business demand. And there were 3 items that was very interesting that the lady talked about. Business debt, and I know most of you are, maybe just working on the software projects, but some of you might be managers and you have to support many applications. They had to support over 1,000 applications that they inherited and got over the years, because Verizon is a big company now. They bought companies, got applications. They had no clue how many of the more than 1,000 applications was actively used, what the cost is to run it, and if they get a return on investment. They spent 2 years looking at every single app to figure out, is it used? For what is it used? Do we have a simple application where we can move people over? They reduced the number of apps by more than 400, which also allowed them to work on technical debt. They had obviously a huge variety of technology stacks. They had different versions of Tomcat and JBoss and WebSphere running, and basically they consolidated everything so that maintaining and supporting these stacks became much easier. And the other thing that was very interesting, organizational rust. They said back in 2011 they tried to go agile and they failed, mainly because people were not ready. Now they are ready, and some of the people that were not ready back then are no longer with the company. So sometimes it has to, some radical changes will happen. Overall, they had to simplify, which was a key thing, and here are just some stats from them, what I thought was very interesting. I told you about the applications that they eliminated. They consolidated data centers from 13 to 5. It was quite phenomenal. They go moving, most of it to virtual. Yeah, a lot of interesting stats. What's next for them? Starting by January 2016, they are 100% agile. That means every single project that they do is now agile. It took them several attempts, but now they're there. And what they are really doing, what they're now looking at are the concepts of DevOps. And as I said before, there's so much crap out there that talks about DevOps. So don't believe everything, but there's a lot of good stuff out there as well. For me, the technical vehicle to implement DevOps, building a nice pipeline where people can work on the same software much easier, is continuous delivery, obviously. So in case you have not read up, there's some great books from Jess Humble and David Farley. I think that's the initial Bible. And then what I also encourage everybody to read, if you are interested in this, it's a book called The Phoenix Project. Has anybody read this book by any chance? Yeah? Good book, right? It's amazing, yeah? So if you have not seen it, it's not a technical book. It's written as a novel explaining the transformation of a company, how they did traditional business and what they did to change their culture especially. Now the thing is, with continuous delivery and moving things faster to the pipeline, I think the challenges are if we have a car or a pipeline that allows us to drive faster and deliver faster, if we don't know how to steer that car, then we may also fail faster. And that's what we want to avoid, obviously. I think what we really want to avoid is something like this, blind automation. So just by adding a Jenkins to your toolkit that then executes your builds on a check-in basis and just blindly promotes everything out there, this is going to be a very ugly pipeline, and in the end, you just have crap coming out. And that's not what you want. From my perspective, I'm a big fan of metrics. I've showed you some metrics before in the example of the casino and the other financial company. Because I think we can use metrics to make smart decisions. What you see here is a chart that I hope every one of you that runs your software has. What this is a so-called availability chart. Is my software actually available to my end users? And that does not mean I can ping the server from my laptop that stands next to my server. This means, is the software actually accessible from the locations where my users are using it? And for that, we typically use something like synthetic monitoring. What we see here is an availability graph. And as you can see here, when this is the time of the deployment and then the availability drops down to 0, you probably know you just crashed the car. Right? And that's when you need to act and fix it. Another thing where metrics are very handy, this is an example of the yellow pages in France. The yellow pages in France allow people to obviously look up companies, right? Yellow pages. And they have three major use cases. People using the iPhone, the Android version, and also the responsive design, just of the web application. And they recently had a new version of their Android app, and they wanted to roll it out to 1 million users. And the marketing team, however, was smart. They said, instead of sending out emails to 1 million users, we work close with development and say, we know you cannot build the perfect software. There will be problems. So what we do to help you is we start sending out only 1,000 emails. Then we watch, are people actually downloading it? Are they using it? How many people use the new version? And in case there are any problems, we give you the details of these problems so that you can fix it before we send out the next 1,000 emails. So that was basically an approach to, in a staged environment, send out emails and get the next people on board and then fix things. Because if they send out 1 million emails right away and there's some basic bugs in there, then it's a total waste of time and money. Make sense? Another metric that is very important for me especially, and it should also be for you, is performance in general. I think there's been so many studies out there, whether it's from companies like Walmart, that's retail, or from Google, from Bing, Yahoo, they all did studies that there's a huge impact that performance has on the end user. Whether it's conversion numbers, or whether Google had a great study a couple of years ago that they said they artificially slowed down search results for a certain group of people to see what the impact is. If the searches were slower, people were searching less and therefore clicking less on the paid links. When they flipped back the switch to normal speed, these people never came back to their original number of searches per day. Because performance and user experience manifests itself in your head, and you just work with the software differently. And Microsoft and Google, they blogged about this. Now let me ask you, who of you is responsible for code and the code was not originally developed by you? Nice, okay. And I assume that all of you base your code on code that is not yours either, because your code runs in a container, in an application server, so you use libraries like Hibernate, like Spring. It's also not yours, but you're responsible for it. And you're building more software on top of each other. And then you inherit and you add more and more, and you never actually take things out. Why don't you take things out? Because you really don't know. Maybe this is useful code. And basically what we do, what I think we do, we basically just add bad code one layer on top of each other, which we also call technical debt. And what's very scary, and this is a number now from a study that was conducted in the US 2 years ago, 80% of engineering time in the US in 2013 was spent in maintaining and bug fixing code. That means only 20% is there to innovate. And that's very scary, especially for companies that have a lot of legacy code. And then the next Uber is coming up, or the next Facebook is coming up, and they start from a clean slate. And what's even scarier, in the US alone, $60 billion was the cost impact of bad software. That is lost revenue if Amazon goes down, that is brand damage, and that's additional labor costs if you have to fix these things. And I think the reason for this is because we are focusing on quality too late. We should all know, especially the students all here. I know there's some students in here. Please don't think it's just code cool things and then who cares about this here? I'm not responsible for this anymore. It starts here. We need to start fixing problems early on and build better software from the start. Otherwise, we end up like this in a very fun room, which is called the war room. And it's called the war room for a reason, because it's typically not a very friendly environment. This was the war room from Facebook in 2012, and I'm sure they had more war rooms earlier this year, a couple of weeks ago, when they went down a couple of times. And the war rooms mean people there not for a fun reason, not to do some code hacking sessions. How can we get out of here? And I think there are some promising numbers that I see from my perspective. I told you that I work with a lot of people, like the guy from Noka Casino, and there are people coming to me and they send me their data, and I analyze it. And what I see that in 80% of the data that comes to me, I always find the same small number of problems. This is my 80-20 rule. In 80% of the problems that I see are only caused by 20% problem patterns. And this is, I think, very promising, because I think if we focus on these, we can build much better software. And I like learning from others, and I want to give you now 4 use cases of why software failed, how to avoid it, and also which metrics to look at. And it's either software projects I've been personally involved in or people called me in. And I want you to take some of these metrics home and maybe on Monday probably check your code base and see if you might also be suffering from the same problems. Every time when I start one of these use cases, I always try to find a funny picture to kind of explain what the story is all about. And I'll typically let this settle in a little bit. What do we see here? Mm-hmm. The boots are the wrong way around, okay, yeah. That has never come up, yeah. What somebody else said, reinventing the wheel, right? We think we're the best engineers, so we can build a better Hibernate. We can build a better jQuery because we're so cool, right? Maybe we can. But typically, we should build our code based on these components and just build new features on top of these frameworks. However, what I often see is that we are blindly using or reusing these components without even thinking what these components are doing and how we should use them in our environment. And the first thing happened to me last year. So within Dynatrace, I'm responsible now for our free trial program. So you can go to our website, sign up, and you get a license. That's free for you. What I can also do, when I took on the project, I wanted to be able to get your business card maybe, and I invite you because I don't trust you that you really go online later. So I wanted to be able to invite people and then also have a report that tells me, did you actually get that email? Did you click on that link? Did you use the product? So I asked the developer that implemented the whole backend feature of sending out emails and all that stuff to please, I need a report from you. I need it now. And it can be simple. It can be as simple as this. This is what I demanded. A report where I can go in and say, I invited this guy, this guy, this guy. This is the status. They already have a license and so on. Doesn't have to look pretty because it's just for me. I push this guy, and this guy never ever in his life has implemented a website like this. But obviously because I pushed him, what did he do? What does every good engineer do if you have a task that is new and challenging? Say it again? Google it, exactly. So he Googled sample app, creating an HTML table out of 2 database tables. Because there were 2 database tables in the back. And what he found was a sample app using Hibernate, which is a good thing, general. But the sample app had a little flaw, which we didn't see until 3 months into the project, when the page became slower and slower to create. This page here, 3 months into the project when it was live, took a minute to render for 3 lines. And it became slower with every day. And then I talked with him. Unfortunately, the guy was on a different project now. So the guy who took over said, it's not my code base. It looks like Hibernate, but I think everything looks good. And on my machine, everything is fast. Of course. So what we did, we actually looked at which database statements was Hibernate actually executing to generate that report. So what you see here is now an output of the product that we use to get these details. But by the way, you can also there's logging features in Hibernate while you're developing. So Hibernate actually logs out the statements. But we captured this in production. And we saw, in order for me to get these 3 lines, there was actually 4,000 database statements being executed by Hibernate. Because what the sample application did that he used, it basically had a loop to iterate through all the objects in the table. And what he did in that loop, he said he had an if statement. If this trial user was invited by Andy, then print it out. Otherwise, next loop. So that means Hibernate every time had to download every single element from the database. And because we were adding more and more people to the database with every day, the code had to load more and more rows every time I executed that report. And that made it slower and slower. And the reason why Alex, he was the new guy who inherited the code, didn't find it because he only had the sample database with 10 rows in there that was checked in the test case. Okay, so that's a very bad. I don't say Hibernate is bad, but I say you have to use it correctly. There's a lot of things that you can do with Hibernate. We fixed this, and now it's down to a handful of SQL statements to generate that report. What I'm always looking at is metrics. I'm always looking at the number of SQL statements being executed, also the number of same SQL statement. If the same SQL statement, just with a different bind value, is executed all over again, this is the classical n+1 query problem. So watch out for it. It's very easy to detect. And also the rows processed. So there's options that you can say, do we retrieve 10 rows or 1,000,000 rows? Why do we need 1,000,000 rows? So maybe we have a flaw in our implementation. Make sense? Who uses Hibernate? Who knows how to look at the SQL statements generated? Okay, good. Next example. Beautiful house. Architect made some changes. First wind came through and blew the house away. I call it architecture's gone wild. Also happened to me 2 years ago. Who is aware of Confluence? Software from Atlassian, yeah? Confluence is a great product. We use Confluence to host our online community portal. That means every Dynatrace user, all the free trial users, can get access to our community portal. And this is how it looked like 1.5 years ago. We had 53,000 members out on there. Now we have more than 100,000, but it was 53 back then. And I was responsible for that portal. And people were saying, there's good stuff on there, but it is extremely slow when I search. If I put something in the forum and I get an answer, there's no social features that I would expect. I don't get any emails. I don't get any pop-up notifications, nothing. And if I look at this on my iPad, it looks ugly. And I said, that's all fair. And I looked at the software version that we used of Confluence. It was like 3 years old, 2 or 3 years old. And then I looked up the release notes of Confluence, of the current version, and it said, huge performance improvements, social features, and optimized for mobile devices. So I thought, awesome, we just upgrade the version and maybe do a little facelift, and then everything will be good. What we did before we upgraded, so we only had a production environment. We didn't have any staging or testing environment because it's an off-the-shelf product, right? So what we did on a couple of Sundays before we did the upgrade, we ran a load test against the old system. And the load test was doing 4 things, because we knew that from looking at what our people do in real life, because we have production monitoring, so we know people go to the homepage, they log in, they execute a search, and go to the documentation. 4 steps. So we simulated that with a load testing tool and ran a test over 2 hours, and we ramped up from 0 users to 200 users. And the other thing that we saw, that we looked at, is how many requests are actually executed per user. So for these 4 steps, my users had to execute 200 HTTP requests, right? Which is downloading the HTML, all the JavaScripts, and all that stuff. So it was our baseline. Then we upgraded on a Sunday because we thought everything will be good, but in case something goes wrong, we still have Sunday night to roll back. So we upgraded and then ran the same load test again, and we had to abort the load test after a short time because the whole system crashed. And the one key metric that told me why it crashed was the number of requests that are now being executed to do the same 4 steps. Going to the homepage, logging in, search, and going to the documentation. Now it jumped to 400 to do the same things. That means my users had to download twice as many JavaScript files, twice as many images, and all that stuff. Why did it happen? Because I turned on every single feature that was on by default in the new version of Confluence, which was downloading 15 different jQuery plugins that was making 5 to 10 different AJAX calls to populate all these, like, hey, you have a notification here, notification here, notification here. So that in total added to twice as many HTTP requests, and that basically killed our infrastructure. And actually, for me, it's embarrassing because over the last 5 years, I was preaching about web performance optimization, not making exactly these mistakes. But I was blind because I thought it's just a normal product that I buy and I just upgrade. But I never really looked at it. How does it really look like after the upgrade? And we didn't do the upgrade in a staging environment first. And that was very blind. So the key metrics that I'm looking at is the items per page. That's very key. So if you are doing web development, check out, do we have 1 image on the page or 500 images on the page? Do we have 1 jQuery minified, all merged together, or do you have 15 different jQuery plugins? Like jQuery is another interesting story. I'm sure you also have heard it here, healthcare.gov in the US 2 years ago when this whole system crashed, the Obamacare website. The first web page, I mean, it had a lot of flaws, but the first version of the website had 25 different jQuery files on there. Because they just, under time pressure, forgot to apply the standard rules of optimizing web pages. I don't think the web developers were stupid, but they probably had no time and nothing was automated. So items per page and also the number of XHR requests or HX requests that you execute. Like in my case, we had so many cool social features in there and everything was going off with a different HX call. That killed our servers. Next example that I have for you. What does this tell us? That hopefully it's fake, of course, but what this tells me is if I would be the train operator, I typically assume I know what the environment looks like, right? I assume I have a straight track. Who is doing mobile development? Who is developing for Android, for iOS? Okay, good. What are the biggest challenges if I'm looking at mobile now?
Fragmentation.
Fragmentation of what?
Operating system version,
Yeah.
screen sizes.
Exactly. Like there's like only so many iPhones, but there's so many Androids and different platforms, yeah? So the thing is, you cannot assume you really know the environment. So if you're developing for Android, you can only test, you can do a good job in testing, but you will never be able to test everything. This example happened to a company called Runtastic. It's a sports tracking app. Does anybody have Runtastic or anything similar? Yeah, sports tracking. So Runtastic is actually a company from my hometown, from Linz, Austria. They got recently bought by Adidas, but they are, I think, #1 in sports tracking, or pretty much #1 in the world. What's interesting about sports tracking apps is, and I have a couple of users here, if something goes wrong with the sports tracking app, you typically don't uninstall it and switch to the next one, because you actually take the benefit of the tool if you use it more and more, because it can tell you, today your workout was so much better than last week, and next week this is your goal. So that's why I guess all of you stick to one product, and you build up the history and you can add use new features. However, when something breaks and fails consistently, you may go off on Twitter and on Facebook and tell your friends that this Runtastic is not really good and blah, 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 and hate it. When it works, however, and you do your workout, and at the end you say, share with my friends on Facebook so that they can all like me how well I did, right? The generation we live in. This is an example of one of the users, and he was on a road bike for 1 hour. And at the end of the 1 hour, the tool told him, you just biked 480 kilometers per hour. It's impressive. I would sign up for the Olympics. Obviously, this is a situation where you're not sharing it on Facebook, but you basically start a shitstorm on Twitter. Or you call their tech support if you're a loyal customer and a paying customer of their premium product. And that's what this guy did. And he said, it's embarrassing, so please fix it. The developers saw this and said, we've never seen this internally. We have a lot of test cases. We use the major Android versions. What's odd, though, is these 2 points here. It shows 20 kilometers, but it's only a couple of 100 meters. So we assume there's a problem with the GPS calculation between 2 well-known coordinates on certain devices. What they then also said is if we cannot test this internally, we just push the test out to all of our users. So they basically built the unit test into their main app, which gets executed every time when somebody opens the app, it does a sanity check. Does this device actually calculate the GPS location or the distance correctly? If yes, everything is good. If no, they report back device, manufacturer, OS version, and all that stuff. So they use, it's called real user monitoring for mobile applications. So you can see here one of the users, they're opening up the app, they are doing the login on Facebook, and then at the very beginning they have this location distance too incorrect. That's the unit test. And they let this unit test fail and report back something went wrong. And what's really cool now is what they could actually figure out by looking at all the errors that came in and then basically look at the dimensions like what's the device and what's the Android version. They could find out that this only happens on certain Android versions, on certain devices, went on Google, well-known problem, on that Android version on that device. So obviously they cannot fix it, but what they could do with this information, they are Said something? Exactly, tell the users. So they now, every time they find a new device, they basically, their marketing team goes off on Twitter and say, sorry Runtastic guys, if you're on this new version of Android on this device, you may experience problems. Don't blame us, upgrade your OS. That's proactive. That's much better than waiting for the next bad feedback on Twitter. Okay? Another cool thing what they do, most mobile apps, and those of you that develop mobile apps maybe as well, if you have a login feature, you typically let people log in through Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn account. And they are also using Facebook, and they were monitoring response times of Facebook API that they use. And they figured out that when people actually work out, they typically don't run, I mean here in the city, yeah, but a lot of people run out in the woods somewhere, in the middle of nowhere, where you don't have LTE or 3G connection. So at the end of your run, however, you want to, as fast as possible, tell your friends how cool you are. Click on it, obviously, that typically takes a long time, and what they had a very small timeout. So basically the app crashed because Facebook never came back within the 5 seconds of the default timeout. What they could do with the data, they could figure out, hey, if people are in certain geographic locations, we need to increase the timeout because otherwise Facebook fails, and that crashes our app. So now they're dynamically adapting the timeout settings depending on the connection speed that people have. Lessons learned from them. And in general, they also monitor is Facebook in general having an issue, and if there's a Facebook outage that they can see immediately because the users experience it, they can also go on Twitter and Facebook and say, it seems Facebook is currently down, not our fault, maybe upload your results once it's available again. Okay. So the key metrics I always look at is the number of functional errors, like the GPS problem that I said before, number and status of third-party calls, and also the payload of calls. The payload, I think, is very important. If you're developing a new mobile app, whether it's native or also web mobile, you need to consider that if you force a lot of people to download a lot of content, they need to pay the bill. They need to pay the bill in the end. I'm not sure how your data plans here are, but if you design a new feature and implement a new feature, you should know if the user goes to the homepage, logging in and doing the main use cases, do we force them to download 100 kilobytes or 10 megabytes? That makes a huge difference. Is there data that I can maybe cache on the device and not downloading it all the time? In Europe, obviously, we have a lot of small countries, and I'm constantly in bordering areas. That means I'm constantly roam. And roaming for me in Europe, it's extremely expensive. And I'm not sure about the data costs here. But I think this is also a responsibility that we have as developers to build good quality software, but also software that doesn't cost the end user on the mobile device a whole lot of money. Last example that I have for you, and I'm a big fan of US sports. Does anybody watch? I know you like rugby, but does anybody watch the American football, the Super Bowl? No? Anybody? Yeah, at least one hand. So even if you don't like the sport, what they really have going on there is the main sponsors, they produce these TV spots that are world famous. They just produced them for this event. And Kia last year produced a spot for 90 seconds, Hollywood production with some Hollywood actors, Godzilla chasing their cars through Chicago. 90 seconds spot is $12 million to get this on air. It's a lot of money. Right? I'm picking on you now, okay? So you are the marketing guy of Kia now who came up with that idea. What do you expect from the $12 million? Why do you spend $12 million? Exactly. So all the people that are drunk and watching the Super Bowl, Kia, exactly. So you basically can expect that a lot of people will hit your website. And you should probably prepare for that. Spike load. Right? Is anybody here in e-commerce? Or is anybody responsible for apps? Yeah? You have certain spikes. You have certain dates in the year where a lot of people hit your site. So you should prepare for that. Now, what I say here is if you think big, you should start small. You will see the same chart again that I showed you before. This is the availability chart of Kia.com during the Super Bowl. They were 100% available until the ad went on air, and then the site became unavailable. And the reason here is there's some interesting things. So the reason why the site, there were multiple reasons. But they had this great ad that they also wanted to see, that they wanted to have everybody to see when they get to the website. So everybody was forced to download that video, high resolution images. They were using Facebook and Twitter and everybody else that was used by every other company that also advertised at the same time. So all of these third-party providers were hit the most during the Super Bowl, which also impacted them. So Richard, $12 million spent well for my story, not for your business. There's, however, and there's a second example that I want to tell you, GoDaddy. And we also monitored GoDaddy. So basically this, what we saw before, that's availability, and here we are monitoring response time. And the response time of GoDaddy was between 1.5 and 2.5 seconds before the Super Bowl. 1 hour before the Super Bowl, we saw an interesting phenomenon. The site became 4 times faster. Why? More load balancing, so more servers maybe. Yeah, putting more money on more hardware in the mix, that's one option. Yeah.
Disabling features.
Disabling features, here we go, yeah. Yeah, and nobody saw their ad and went online. Yeah, it could also be. So what I thought when I saw this, probably the site crashed and the only thing they deliver is like a funny page, like sorry, come back later. That's what I thought. What really happened is what you just said. They said, and we spend millions of dollars to get people to our site, we want to show them what we sell. We don't need to show them what their friends think about us on Facebook. We don't need to show them what's going on Twitter. We don't need to show them the high-resolution product pictures, but we just narrow it down to the smallest amount of features on their website that makes it still functional and is focused on transporting that message. So they were 100% available, 4 times faster, and at the end of the Super Bowl, they flipped back the switch to the original page. And this is well prepared, and this is actually also what DevOps is all about, because here, marketing talked with the operations guys, with the developers, building in the feature switches, testing it out correctly. Because this is not easy. Switching here at a certain point in time, you will have active users on the site, so you want to make sure that they're not impacted. What was very interesting, so the standard page of GoDaddy at this time had 26 different domains where it downloaded software from. 26, so their own servers, CDNs, and then all the third party. In this period, they only had 8. That means they got rid of 18 third-party domains in that period of time, because they said we just focus on our stuff. That's what we have under control. That's why I'm also looking at always the number of domains and also the total size of content. Okay, you should always do a sanity check. So, what have you learned today? Hopefully a lot of metrics. Okay. I have a second session in the afternoon where I'm going more specifically into more somewhat web front-end, but also more back-end examples, giving you more metrics. But hopefully you still remember some of these metrics I just showed you. However, what I don't want you to do, I don't want you to do this manually every day on every single build that you are building or every single code check-in. Because what we really want to do is we want to automate. Just as the guys that I mentioned in the beginning from Capital One, where they say there's no manual things, there are no manual steps, they do everything automated. Because we want to get to here, and I think what we want to have is a nice, beautiful pipeline, not crap coming up, but real good water or good software that we can confidently give to our end users and they're not choking. So I think what we need quality gates. And here's a question for you. Who is using Jenkins, Bamboo, TeamCity, or anything they like? Awesome. I hope all of you also have some unit tests or integration tests or functional tests that are executed on a build-to-build basis. There's one guy smiling. Sure. So here's my question. What do these tests actually test? What does a unit test test? What does the unit test tell you if it succeeds? Exactly. Basically, function, he said the code works based on the functionality. So if I have a search API and I'm testing the search API, it always returns the 3 results. So basically what you're doing, if this is your code base, then you are testing the tip of the iceberg. you are testing test failures, test rate. You may have some code coverage as well. What I'm telling you, if you have all of these tests already that you execute and you only check the functionality, why not bundle them up and also look at metrics that I just told you? And here's how it could look like. It's not, I know it's very simplified, but here's an example. If you have a build 17 and you have two test cases, test purchase and test search, and everything is green, it means purchase probably puts the item in my database, and search result brings exactly the searches that I'm expecting, green. What's your name? Yeah? Huh? Tommy? Tomic. Okay, Tomic. So if you are responsible for the purchase and you check something in and you break the code, what do you do? Exactly. You're very happy that you just broke the build, first of all, right? And then you fix the code probably very fast, because what you really want to do is build new features. So you build it as fast as possible. And I've even heard, not you, but I've even heard from developers that sometimes change the test to make sure it's actually green again. I don't know if this happened. It could happen. Because this is beautiful for management, obviously, right? Green. So what I'm telling you now, why not look behind the scenes and bundle up your tests with your profiling tools, with your tracing tools, whatever tools you have, with your turn on the Hibernate logging feature to say how many database statements are actually executed, how many exception objects are created, how much time is spent on CPU, how many images do we have on the page. All of these metrics I told you before. Because if we capture these metrics, first of all, it allows you to get a better picture on what your code is actually doing internally. Helps great for code reviews as well. If I'm the architect or the team lead and say 12 SQL statements for purchase, yeah, could make sense. If a test now fails and you have all of these metrics, you might get much more information than just the JUnit assertion, because the JUnit assertion says purchase didn't put item into the database or something like that. But if you see that actually there were 5 exception objects being, or 5 exceptions being thrown within Hibernate because I made a Hibernate configuration change, then this gives me much more insight into what the problem is. Okay? So if I fix it then, and typically still quick and dirty, then actually by looking at these metrics, you may know, hey, yes, I fixed it functionally, but I just introduced a regression, an architectural regression as I call it. Because now we're executing 6 times as many database statements as before. And we're spending twice as much time on CPU. Even though that test is still executing super fast and functionally correct, this will kill you later on once this feature gets deployed and is used by 1,000 users. Because then you need to buy new hardware for your database servers, and you're killing that database server. The same example that I had with my report. So what I think, if we look at these metrics, then we can get back to functional green and to also architectural green. And obviously, there's different tools that can do this. This is just one way how it, for instance, looks in our tool. Every line here represents a test, whether it's a JUnit test, an NUnit test, a Selenium test, a JMeter test that tests an API. And for all of these tests, we look at these metrics like database count, time, overall time, how many calls into Hibernate. And what we also do for all of these metrics, we are basically looking at them on a build to build to build basis. And what you see here on the bottom, we actually calculate a baseline. Because what is good? Is 12 good or is 25 good? Who knows? You could go there and define the threshold manually for all of your 1,000 tests if you have the time. But we believe we should baseline it. And then we basically learn from the first tests. Then we baseline it. And in case you make a code change and that changes that behavior, then we flag that test as being a problem. And then we can break your Jenkins build. We can break your Bamboo or TeamCity build. So one visualization, another visualization, or as I said before, you can integrate it into Jenkins. And I don't care with which tool you're using it, but I think the idea is important. Okay? My journey and my contribution to the community is I want to make quality a first-class citizen. Because I've been working in quality for so many years, and I'm really, I'm sure I'm used to the word, I'm pissed that I'm always getting to see the same problems all over again. These problems are not new. They've been around for 10, 20 years probably. But we still make the same mistakes. So what I don't want to hear anymore, it is like too hard. It is actually not too hard because the tools are all out there. It's also not cool enough. Well, it might be not cool enough, but what's also not cool is if you have to spend your weekends and nights with bug fixing. That's really not cool. And also things like we'll get around this later, this is also not the right attitude. Because if then your software makes it into production, then something like this may happen. What happened to United Airlines in the summer? They deployed a new version of their check-in software on the kiosks and the airports, and nobody could check in flights anymore. Yeah? We'll get around this later. Yeah? Not sexy enough, not cool enough. So a quick recap. I want you to not go home now, but when you go home, pick your metrics. I showed you some today, and I'll show you more in the afternoon. Don't take 20. Start with 2 or 3. And then figure out how you can get to this metric on your local machine, in your CI environment, in your testing, and also in production. So pick your metrics, and we'll learn a little bit more about this later in the afternoon. Level up you and yourself and your teams. There are a lot of tools out there, whether it is Dynatrace, New Relic, App Dynamics, any profiler. Most of these tools have a free version, just as we have a New Relic and App Dynamics, they also have free versions that you can use. So there's no excuse anymore. And also, if you're a web developer, you all know that the built-in browser diagnostics tools, Magic Finger, Magic Key F12 in every browser, even in Internet Explorer. Okay? And also do me the favor, use Internet Explorer. Because believe it or not, there's a lot of people out there that still use it. And if you're just testing it on your Chrome and Safari, then this is not the real world. Then automate the heck out of it. Automate as much as possible. Why? Because if like last night we had a dinner, and if I had to try too many beers, the very good beers that they have here, and I have to do manual tests today, probably my quality of manual tests is not as good as it normally is. And the automated testing tool doesn't get a hangover, just like me. And also integrate as much as possible. So you should integrate it with your testing, with all your tools. I think this is a key thing. All of these tools out there integrate into your environment. Because if we do this, I'm a strong believer we can build better software faster, and then hopefully you become the next unicorn. Remember in the beginning? The unicorns, and then the next generation of unicorns, and you might be the next company that can then stand here next year at the conference and talk about how you optimized your pipeline, how you develop software much faster with more confidence, and you go home on a Friday afternoon and you know the deployment that will go in on the weekend will be good. Okay? Good. I hope this was useful as a start. I know this was a session that was not originally planned. I will talk more about performance problems and metrics in the afternoon. The last thing I want to tell you is this here, what we have. We have a little challenge from Dynatrace. If you go to apm.apmchallenge.eu, you can, well, we give away a tablet. But the challenge is you need to guess how fast your company's website is on average from 3 different locations. So what actually happens here is you enter your email. What we do, we take the domain of your email, and then on the next page say we're going to run a test. We run it from London, from New York, and from Johannesburg. So we have 3 synthetic tests out there that ping your website, that load your website, and then take the average. And you need to guess what the average is. And the person closest, that has the closest guess, will win the tablet. Okay? So you have time. You can do this throughout, like today and tomorrow. I think we have a little booth over there, like my colleague is standing over there. You can look at the leaderboard so you can see what's going on. You can only do 1 entry per email. Okay? But if you have colleagues, like I know Standard Bank has a lot of people here. So that's the idea. Okay? So apm.apmchallenge.eu. Think about it. What is the response time? And what we consider as response time, how long does it really take until the full page is loaded? So that means if you go, for instance, to the page on your Chrome, you hit F12, and then you open up that page, and you see in Chrome in the development test tools and the dev output what the time is. And then we test it, as I said before, from London, New York, and from Johannesburg, and then we do an average. All right? Okay. These are just some of my details. As I said before, I do a lot of speaking. I have all of my slides on my SlideShare account. You can get our tools as well on this bit.ly link. I have YouTube tutorials where I basically talk about these problems and how I analyze these things online, and I put this on YouTube. Feel free to follow me, but don't stalk me. And if you want to read more about this, there's also the blog that we have. All right. I hope it was, remember metrics. We can build better software faster, looking at quality, looking at the right metrics. And I hope this was good. Thank you.
Are you going to take any questions, or should we do it later today?
What time is it? Oh yeah, I can take. I guess I got 2 more minutes, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anybody have a question?
What's the difference, or can you tell the advantages of different tools?
So the question is, what's the advantage of different tools? So obviously, I think it's unfair for me to answer that question because I'm biased. But I think what's good is that all of these tools that I mentioned, and I will have a list of them in my second talk, you can try most of these tools for free, and then you figure out what the best tool is for your job. If you would ask me, you know what the answer is. But that would be unfair. So do your evaluation. It's all good tools. You were mentioning the cloud. You don't need to send the data off to somewhere else. There's also tools that capture this data locally. Like our tool can be installed either locally or you can report it into the cloud. But if they install it locally, then they maintain everything, they host everything, and then they can just. It's still their data. And then if there's a problem, then they can say, now I'm giving it to you, exactly the data that you need for that time frame when the problem happened. But I think typically the argument is, what's your impact right now? Let's improve it, yes or no? Yeah. I know it sounds easy. It's not that easy. But
Okay, guys, we're going to have a speakers panel at the end of the day. So if you have any questions, just write it down and we'll address it. Thanks very much for